When the United States entered World War II, it had an impact that extended far beyond the battlefields of Europe, Northern Africa, and the Pacific. The war affected nearly every aspect of daily life, and this was especially true of women, millions of whom entered the workforce to fill positions vacated by men sent to fight overseas. And while the women's war effort was celebrated on the home front, and Rosie the Riveter became a household name, there was one group of women whose practice trade was far less acceptable: war correspondent. Joining me today from Washington, D.C., as Women's History Month draws to a close, is filmmaker Michele Midori Fillion, director of the documentary No Job for a Woman: The Women Who Fought to Report World War II. Welcome, Michele.
Thank you so much, Michele.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. Before we start talking about some of the remarkable journalists featured in your film, can you first give us a sense of the difficulty it took for women in the 1930s or the 40s to even establish a career in this field?
Well, actually, the women that preceded the World War II era, and there were a number of them, the typical journalist, the typical reporter female would have been reporting for what was called the women's pages. And the women's pages actually started in the late 1800s as part of an advertising supplement. And they reported on things that were genteel. When women, a woman reporter would not have been in the newsroom because that was a masculine domain, rough and tumble. A woman, a lady, would have been covering more genteel subjects such as what they call the 4Fs: food, fashion, family, and furniture. So the women's pages contained all of those things, and there were advertisements as well. And coming into World War II, there were a number of women in Europe that were what are called by historians of women's history the new woman. So this was somebody in the model of a Katharine Hepburn, who was strong, independent, independent-minded, had a career. And there were a number of women that this new woman was modeled after, and one of them was one of the main characters in No Job for a Woman, Martha Gellhorn, but there was also Dorothy Thompson, Sigrid Schultz, Helen Kirkpatrick. And these were women that were at the top of their field, and coming into World War II, the big surprise was that women were going to be restricted. All of these women were prepared to go and cover the war, and in fact, Martha Gellhorn had been covering war, but once the United States was officially in the war, the military did not want women at the front lines. They wanted to contain where reporters could and could not be, and they particularly wanted to contain the women.
How did you set about trying to tell this story in terms of finding scholars and contemporary war correspondents to interview, as well as combining news footage and using actresses to portray Dickey Chapelle, Martha Gellhorn, and Ruth Cowan?
Well, over a period of time when I first read a book called Women of the World, The Great Foreign Correspondents, and it was about women war correspondents. And I had never heard of most of these women, and I frankly was shocked. I couldn't believe that I hadn't heard of them. One woman's life in particular, Dickey Chapelle, who was a war photographer, she lived this incredible life, and I determined that I would someday make a film about her life. And as I did more research, and this was way back before the internet when I first started thinking about this, I would be in libraries and I would be looking up her articles and her photographs and things like that. And then as I started to do more research, I thought, well, it would be interesting to do a group portrayal, because different people, different women had different strategies of how to become a war reporter. And when I first started down this road with the group of women, I focused on a group of 8 women, and it really came down to who had the most documentation. And that was things like biographies written about them, or they wrote autobiographies, or there were photographs and things like that. And I applied to the National Endowment for the Humanities for a research grant and received it, which was fantastic. I started working with different scholars, Maureen Beasley, who's an eminent women's historian, and also women in journalism history. And so with the group of scholars that we eventually brought together for the documentary, we were able to, pool the research, and then once I got the production grant, again from the National Endowment for the Humanities, we were able to then, start to go to archives and really pull together all of the images and things like that. Now, having said all that, the particular women at that time, and it's hard to believe, living today, that there weren't a lot of people didn't have a lot of photographs of themselves, and even the photographer didn't have a lot of photographs of herself, and they didn't have footage. That was very rare to have had footage of these women. So that's when I determined that rather than just focusing on a contemplative image of a landscape or water and having a voiceover, why not use actors who could bring this story to life?
In looking at coverage of the war, it's striking how pronounced gender roles were, especially in the type of war coverage that was offered. I want to show this clip that features some of these now dated notions of femininity.
In Cowan's stories, women still seem to be women. Yes, they were wearing the government's uniforms. Yes, they were doing non-traditional jobs. But, and this is where we sigh a sigh of relief back home when we're reading this, they are women after all.
Now, what was it like for someone like Ruth Cowan to have to write about the challenges women in the military faced in terms of maintaining one's femininity in difficult circumstances? It has to be a little surreal to see what one sees in the war and then have to write about such trivial things like washing a brassiere or something, I'd imagine, no?
Well, Ruth Cowan, who's one of the main characters, she was a wire service reporter, and she was actually the oldest of the characters going into World War II. So she actually had the longest career. And where she came from was covering the woman's angle. And so the woman's angle, and this is very important in the history of journalism and certainly in the story that I'm telling in World War II, is that she, if there was ever a story, there would always be a sidebar element called the woman's angle. So if an important prime minister was coming to town, what was his wife doing? And she would cover the woman's angle. So Ruth Cowan was taken to, started in North Africa. She went along with the WACs. And what she was really doing, as I was saying earlier, is she was showing the home front what were the women doing, what were the nurses doing, and that this was really important for the home front to see that these women were still doing sort of feminine things. And that was actually, we're looking at it with our 21st century eyes, looking back, that seemed like a really trivial thing to be doing, but it was really important in terms of morale.
Let's talk about Dickey Chapelle. I'm going to play a clip here. Wartime journalism historian Michael Sweeney describing two pictures Dickey took of a dying soldier.
She takes one picture of a Marine who's bleeding profusely, and he's obviously in agony, but she doesn't think he's going to make it, so much so that in her notes for this photograph she calls him, quote, dying Marine. Well, it turns out he's the perfect person for her to cover because he's given 14 units of whole blood. That's a lot. He must have been leaking like a sieve. But the blood brings him back. The next day, 24 hours later, he looks like he's a new man, and she decides to take his picture again. And side by side, you would swear these were two different people.
So Dickey would go on to cover the Hungarian uprising and the Vietnam War. Did Gellhorn, Dickey, and Cowan make it easier for female journalists to break into the field as a result of what they endured and fought for in their career?
In a word, no. I think what, in my research, what happened was that The women were always the exception to the rule. So they had to, they had to fight in order to become war reporters. They had to fight even to just become reporters, frankly. And so they, did they open a door for other women? They maybe opened it a crack, but the women following them had to fight just as hard.
All right, well, Michele, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today.
Thank you.
That was Michele Midori Fillion, director of No Job for a Woman, The Women Who Fought to Report World War II. You can learn more about the film by visiting the website nojobforawoman.com. And you can find Michele on Twitter at twitter.com/nojobforawoman. For Next Generation, I'm Michelle Fields. Thanks for watching.